welcome to our webinar, True Performance Marketing, How to Align Your Paid and Organic Search Strategies. My name is Christian Møllerstrøm. I'm a managing partner at Precis Digital. We're a Nordics and London-based digital marketing agency, and I'll be presenting today together with Kevin. Do you want to introduce yourself, Kevin?
Yeah, sure. So Kevin Gibbons, founder at Resignal, SEO agency based in London.
Cool. So let's have a quick look at the agenda for today. We're going to be talking about why you should be aligning your paid and organic search strategies. We'll look into how brands can use both paid and organic search in tandem. We'll look at what that means for measurements, and we'll be summarizing with some key takeaways, and we'll have some time for questions as well. We're aiming for the presenting portion of this presentation to take about roughly 30 minutes, which should give us plenty of time for questions afterwards. If you have questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A and we can read them out later, or write them after the end of the presentation as well. Cool.
So one thing we were talking about is that it can't be called performance marketing when all marketing is measurable. And what we mean by that is there's a bringing together here in terms of SEO and paid search. And one of the almost frustrations I have is that performance marketing is looked at as purely a paid search way of looking at things. And actually, what we do, I would see, is we drive organic performance. People are searching in Google, they're clicking on a paid or an organic listing, and they're buying a product. And actually, we're both there from a customer acquisition, marketing ROI perspective. And yeah, really, we're trying to achieve the same outcome and objective, but from different angles. And there's different, obviously, strategies of the different channels themselves, but it really is more aligned than I think sometimes people talk about. And that's what we're trying to maybe in some ways demyth a little bit in terms of, that how do you make that work together? And I don't know if you've got anything to add on that, Christian.
Yeah, definitely. I think how we phrased it in the webinar invite or the sign-up page is that paid and organic are the same thing. Yeah. I imagine quite a few people who are watching right now will probably be asking, like, are they really? They might be a little bit skeptical. But I do think they are, because they're effectively trying to solve the same problem. They're trying to meet user demands while searching online, and they're trying to link that demand to a solution that you can offer, whether that be information, a product, a service. As you said, it's a kind of marketing ROI, right? Yeah. And there are absolutely still some fundamental differences. I think one thing you mentioned in a previous conversation, Kevin, is that you don't want to pay for a click unless you have to. So yeah, if you can meet that need organically, then you should. And simultaneously, if you need something to be turned around very, very quickly, then you're likely going to have a bigger short-term impact through a paid channel, because you can implement that very fast and get visibility. But still, you're trying to solve the same problem, which is meeting user needs while also reaching business objectives. And that's one aspect of why SEO and Ppc are the same. They're trying to solve the same problem. The other aspect, in my opinion, is how they're evolving and what signals they're using to perform. And I think we're going to be talking about that quite a lot today. And what we in our conversations have found to be a very, very big unifying factor here, which is user intent. And I'll take a moment just to put that into a little bit of context. If we look at this very, very, very generalized timeline of kind of like how search in general has progressed. And if we look at the early 2000s, when SEO and Ppc were really coming into their own, things were happening very quickly. Gaming the system in both SEO and Ppc was quite easy to do. Ppc was absolutely ruled by the highest bid, like user relevance or content quality, or I don't know, quality score was just not a factor. Mm-hmm. And SEO was very much a world of backlinking, to a high degree. We obviously saw a lot of evolution and change there. So let's look at about roughly 10 years ago, and granularity and personalization were a really big thing. SEO starts seeing a focus on the quality of content in how it's ranked or prioritized. Ppc is overwhelmingly ruled by single keyword ad groups, or SKAG, as some people like to call it. and really about maximizing your control. And even though we're seeing a shift towards quality and user experience, there's still quite a large gap between what Google perceives to be quality and what the actual users experience as quality. I'm using Google as an example here because obviously biggest search engine, easiest example to use. But what we're seeing now, I'd say very much so as of about 2 years ago, is that user intent is the big factor. And that's where SEO and PPC are really aligning. That you need to be prioritizing user intent and user needs, and you need to be algorithm proof in that sense for a successful strategy. Simultaneously, what we're seeing is that going live with SEO with PPC is easier than ever, and that search has evolved from a very tactical tool to a very strategic tool where we need to be bidding or prioritizing actual business value as opposed to channel or method specific, quite opaque KPIs instead. And I think some examples of how that's changed. For user intent, a couple of years back, we saw RankBrain, of course, which really started looking into what user intent is in searches. What are they actually looking for and wanting to see? And how can that be fed into SEO optimization or PPC optimization? User experience. An example here is called Web Vitals. And that can be anything from mobile first approaches to bounce rates and so forth. And what we've also seen quite controversially the last few years is the expansion of match types, where I think a common complaint I hear is that, exact match doesn't exactly mean what it used to mean. And that's sort of where we are now, where the unifying factor between SEO and PPC is user intent. And I think that's a really strong argument why, from our perspective, they are in a way one and the same. They are two sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's the thing. I remember an example ages ago being given about user intent behind a search term, but it was at the time where you had Apple that were very popular alongside Orange and BlackBerry. And there's a joke there that the fruit and veg industry has obviously clearly faded away very quickly. But I guess actually now maybe Orange and BlackBerry might have been that side of things. But the point is, you're making a search that has multiple meanings. And if you don't know the context around what's that person's search history, or what are the other keywords around that indicates that this modifier means that they're actually looking for fruit and veg, or they're looking for a recipe to do with Apple, as opposed to the technology company and iPhones, etc., then how does Google know? And there's much more that they need to read around that. And I do think, in a positive way, from the SEO industry, I've been involved since 2003, and there's definitely been a growing up of certainly what you were describing, Christian, of early days felt very much manipulation. And it's just, how do you get yourself to be number one in Google by having a footprint that looks like it should be number one in Google, not necessarily deserving to be number one in Google. And then it's definitely been a case of, okay, just because you have a strong brand and domain doesn't mean that you have great content. So what does that content look behind it? So if there's brands in particular that had hundreds of thousands, or in some cases millions of pages, certainly in the early 2000s, that would have got them ranking across the board for absolutely everything, whether that content was strong or not. And now if you've got thin and weak content, you suffer overall as a brand, as opposed to get rewarded because you have a strong brand. And now it's almost balancing out a little bit. I think brand is as strong as ever. But that said, you do need to combine that with, you've got great content, user intent, certainly from an SEO perspective. There's a number of factors now that means if you've got an amazing page of content that's very well optimized, then that maybe 5-10 years ago would have ranked very highly in Google, and it might today. But then when you combine that with the user intent signals that Google can see, your bounce rate back to search, time on site, all of these metrics that they won't take directly from analytics, but they'll know from their search engine data. They own Chrome, etc. They know if you're clicking back and you're not satisfied and you're going for the next listing. And equally, if it's a positive experience, then you are more likely to get rewarded. So that user intent style of looking at things, I feel like it's much more sensible. It's a more mature way of understanding, what it is that those customers and your audience is looking for, and then giving them what they want, as opposed to you have a page that's optimized for a certain number of keywords.
Yeah, and I really I like how you phrased that it's a growing up in a way of the industry.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really accurate way of describing it. And I mean, if we look back for the early 2000s, what that meant for PPC in comparison to SEO, it's kind of the same logic there, where as long as you're bidding enough, your ad's going to be top, regardless of what the user actually wants to be seeing. And obviously, bid still matters enormously, but there are so many other factors at play now that are relevant for the user intent and user experience that if you're also looking at those, then you're going to be significantly outperformed by your competitors, even if you have more budget.
Yeah, that makes sense. And there's one example I wanted to touch on quickly, actually, to do with this, but it was around, we optimized an interior design business, and we had a page that we thought was perfect SEO, which I think touches on the older school way of doing this, of checklist SEO. Is it perfect? And this will lead on to some of the further conversations that we're about to have. But what we found is that by score we get on-page optimization, internal linking, etc. And we found that the rankings went down after we did that. And I think for us, the big learning then was, okay, well, let's understand the user and the experience. When I looked at this, my initial reaction when looking at competitors was these pages aren't very well optimized. There's not that much content on there. They're quite slow and quite heavy. Let's make something quick that's text rich and that is well optimized. That didn't work. But then when I thought about it, it didn't work because you're searching for interior design. People that are searching for interior design want to see a visual experience. They want to understand what that living room looks like, and they want to go on a tour of the house. And that's not necessarily a page load friendly or a text rich page, but it's exactly what they're looking for. And actually what we did afterwards is we almost unoptimized that page, but we looked at the user experience behind it. And by making it more visual and having more concise descriptions that is still optimized to a certain extent, but definitely nowhere near as text heavy, we then increased. And actually for a number of their keywords, they went onto page one and generated a lot of traffic and inquiries from those types of terms. And we would never have got there if we didn't think about customers. If we were just thinking about SEO and search engines, we would have probably still be banging our head against a brick wall right now instead of, but yeah, I think that's the key thing. It's how do you then think about what is it that's going to take you to the next level and actually put yourself in the customer's shoes.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, how you've summarized it in the past, to me, it's kind of this, what's considered best practice is not necessarily best for your brand.
Yep.
And let's look at what we know based on these changes the last few years. We know that Google's understanding of user intent has improved drastically. We know that the metrics looked at for your organic ranking and paid search performance are becoming more aligned. Mm-hmm. We know that keywords themselves have become less exact. They've become more broad for any match type, really. And we know that a wider range of behavioral signals are being used to determine user intent, signals that we don't have access to. Yep. And we know that due to this, and due to the wide range of resources available online, it's easier than ever to execute SEO and PPC campaigns. Mm-hmm. And if we look at what we can infer from that, we can infer that users are more aware and critical than ever of the links or the content they're being shown and the user journey they're being provided. I don't quite want to use the word skeptical, but they're definitely more aware of what a good user journey should look like and what they should be expecting. We know that we can or should exert less control over those search terms and that journey because we need to be matching what the user is intending, actually wants to see. We know that we can infer that there's a lower barrier to entry, which means that there's significantly fiercer competition for lower funnel or keywords that you really want to be showing for. And we know that, or we can infer that because SEO and PPC are aligning from that perspective, undertaking strategies that make sense for one of them will have benefits for the others as well. Yeah. And I really like the example you gave, kind of how, like by not following best practice, you're actually delivering better results. And we've seen similar work in PPC specifically. I think we recently published a case study for one of our clients called Body Store, where it's really about two things. It's about understanding user intent, and it's about understanding what you can control and what you can feed back to optimize those signals. Because if you're looking at it from SEO PPC, right, Google now is making a lot of decisions on your behalf, where 5 years ago, you wanted to have maximum control over that path of decision making. And what we did with Body Store, for instance, is that we, to some people, maybe quite controversially, looked at aggregating keywords or maybe even cross-ad group data. And we were structuring those based on estimated value per click, as opposed to using a very, very traditional, well, this was now traditional single keyword ad group approach. And we were feeding in demographic data, applied audiences. We were reviewing search query data. We were looking at geographic data. And we were then feeding in that value per click from longer term profit analysis or return on investment analysis. And that a lot of those things individually have been available for quite some time. They're not revolutionary in and of themselves, but it does show that by kind of going away from a maximum control or single keyword ad group approach can be delivering significantly improved returns on investment, because you're doing two things. You're making significantly better use of meeting user expectations and user intents, and you're emphasizing, or you're investing your energy in the aspect that you can control, which is determining what result is good for you or not.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's certainly from a control perspective. So going back to the best practice example, I had a client years ago that I remember there was an e-consultancy article that was 50 things to improve your conversion rate. And it was a good article. There's really good tips there. But the client came back to me and she said, I've just gone through this checklist and I've improved all of them, but my conversion rate hasn't gone up. Why? And my answer was, I have no idea. I would imagine you've improved it with some of the changes, and I imagine you've reduced it with some of the others. So if you don't have that granular level of experimentation to know what's worked and what hasn't, how do you improve? And I think the more control that you can get over this on a PPC data, likewise with SEO. SEO to me isn't just throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. It's actually more targeted around how do we have an idea and how do we then try and execute that, clearly measure what we've done. Otherwise, I feel like people can blindly go into, I've read quite a lot of information about, I don't know, what we should be doing on different tactics, and they're just doing it because that's what everyone else is doing, but there's no real way to measure what you're doing at the end of it. You just hope that if you do these 20, 50 different things, it's then a case of crossing your fingers and hoping that it works. And the problem is things don't work like that. So like I say, in that example, some things will work and some things don't. And the more that you can understand and in some cases hold back and say, how do we just test this one theory? Let's make that work for us. Let's learn from it. Let's improve it and then move on to the next thing. Ideally, you'd run things in parallel, but I think you'll get much further by actually just narrowing that focus and making it work for you, proving that it works. And obviously you can get a lot more buy-in once you can say, I did this, it did that. And as opposed to, trying to do too much at once. And then it may work, it may not, but if you don't know why, it's really hard to invest in the future of that.
Definitely. And I think, you gave a really good example about how almost going against the grain and establish best practice for SEO and end up delivering you better results. This Body Store case is an example of how you need to control what you can with, how search is being optimized now in PPC, and that's the data signals you provide to evaluate success. Another example I prepared here is, it's going to look a little strange maybe, but this is our view on kind of how good search structures have evolved And in my opinion, a lot of people are still in this middle one where old school wise, in a traditional structure, you know, you'd have several keywords, several ads for a single landing page, and you just kind of wanted to see what worked. Kind of how's your framing it? You throw something against the wall and you see what sticks.
Mm-hmm.
What most people are still using and what's been really popular for, I'd say, the better part of a decade is these single keyword ad groups, where you try to execute maximum control over how, when, and where you're showing for specific keywords. You are testing different ads, probably on a rotating basis to some degree, but still providing only one landing page. The whole idea here being that you've got full control over which keywords you're being shown for and which landing page you're showing. Yes, you're testing some of the ad copy, but still you're trying to exercise maximum control over that user journey. And for a lot of people, that is still best practice. But what we've been experimenting a lot with the last year and a half and the last 2 years, which is for a lot of people kind of counterintuitive, is letting go of that control. Because that's exactly what we're seeing in these algorithm updates, whether it's for PPC or SEO. You can't control some of those factors anymore. The specificity of a match type isn't as secure as it was in the past. Ad experimentation and rotation is more important than it has been in the past, and there's more formats available and such. But not only that, with these updates and how they're prioritizing user intent and the user experience, you need flexibility in the landing page as well. And we've actually seen that if we relinquish some of that control in a user-driven structure where there is kind of a flexibility in exactly which keyword is being matched to, you're bundling some of them together, you're rotating a number of ads, and you're including a number of landing pages, then Google Ads itself will actually be making better decisions than we will be making on which landing page and which keyword and which ad should be shown. And we've seen significant increases in performance for that, while ironically, it's in a way actually a much simpler structure to be running with. And that's
I feel like in some cases, Google doesn't get enough credit for how smart they are, but they know which ads are going to get higher click-through rates, and they make money from that. So they're going to make sure that your ads are displayed for the right keyword at the right time. And the SEO comparison to that is meta descriptions being very similar to ad descriptions, in the sense of that's what's displayed in your search snippet as you do a query, and within the organic listing that's there. The meta description tag is what, again, if you look at going back kind of 10 years ago, it will be the meta description tag that is displayed. More often than not, Google will now mix up that meta description tag. So if you've got a long tag, it will take part of that. If it decides that actually there's more relevant text on the page than you've written for your own meta description, it will use that instead. And Google is very good at having, if you see this sort of data in Search Console, if you've got keywords that are ranking on a landing page and multiple keywords, that is normally the case, you're not going to have the same ad, call it an ad description, but kind of meta description snippet that's displayed every single time for every keyword on that same page. It's a mix, and it always is. And I think Google is very good at understanding the user intent behind those queries, highlighting what should be displayed in order to best optimize to get that click through. And in some cases, you just need to go with it. And I think our evolution, and probably not just Resignal specific, I think a lot of the SEO industry would be the same with this, is looking beyond keywords and looking more at topics. So what is it that people are really interested in? We know from a search perspective that long tail traffic is really important. It's very hard to do keyword research for long tail traffic, but quite often that's where a large percentage of your organic traffic is going to come from. So if you're thinking about everything for every single keyword that's going to drive you traffic, and bear in mind, I think there's still stats around of every search every day, 10% of those queries are brand new and have never been searched for before until that point in time. You can't research everything, and you have to make it more topic focused. And by doing that and having a mix and a blend of keywords that's attracting traffic to that landing page, it's more likely to work in a way that you can't plan out 100% of the details. So I see what you mean in terms of relinquishing some of the control in order to have the maximum impact. I do think that works both ways.
Yeah. And I mean, I understand why that makes a lot of marketers uncomfortable, because I mean, your ability to build some granularity of control is often, or traditionally, kind of what sets apart a good digital marketer from an amateur one. It's a sense that, you know, you've supposedly got this deep understanding of what will work and what not. You've built a data-driven structure. But particularly in PPC, but I think just in general, I mean, you can want that control back as much as you want, but it's not there anymore. So you can fight against it as much as you want, or you can work with the changes that have been implemented and understand that if you just switch your focus much more to user intent, you will see better results, because otherwise you're just going to be penalized for what you're trying to do.
Yeah, very true.
And I think that's when it gets really interesting to talk about kind of like measurement and evaluation as well. I mean, looking here, you know, like if we accept that the goals are aligning, that they're the same, then that means we also should be measuring and evaluating it the same. And I think one big problem there is siloed thinking. It's kind of similar in the last conversation in a webinar we had a couple of weeks back. We were talking a lot about a lack of strategic approach in both, well, particularly in SEO, but in search in general. And that it's because of a very siloed format of thinking. And you were advocating really strongly for a strategic approach to SEO there, where it's very much outcome based. And I think that aligns really closely with what we were saying earlier in this webinar, that, you know, that you need to be matching the user journey, the user intent, and you need to be modeling your strategy after the business objectives, the outcome that you want to achieve. And I think that's something that people are really overlooking in the strategy. And it sounds very basic, but I still find people building extremely granular strategies where by the end of it, they moved so far away from the actual desired business outcome that they've just invested dozens, if not hundreds of hours in building an advanced SEO or PPC strategy that's not going to deliver what they actually want.
I completely agree with this. And I see so many people overcomplicating what they're doing. When you look at what the outcome is they're trying to achieve, they don't need to do half of it. They just need to actually think about what is it that we're trying to get, and then what's the best way of achieving it. And I think that's the key thing of that. How do you break that down? How do you have a very clear, specific goal that you're going for that ideally is related to business value as closely as possible? If you understand, maybe you've got an organic revenue target from the SEO side, but if you know what it is you're going for, it's then not a case of let's do everything and then hope that works. It's much more, okay, well, we're going for organic revenue. What pages, what topics are driving revenue? How do we make sure we're as strong as possible for that? And then obviously you understand that customer journey and you're looking to attract the right people, but it's not a game of let's make sure we score on a scorecard out of 100 for SEO. How do we get as close to 100? It's much more, how do we understand our customers and how do we reach them in a way that matches their search demand? So I feel like there's a lot that could be done that to me is simplifying the problem, but in a much more efficient, constructive, effective use of time. And I think that's the SEO analogy again here is you can spend so much time chasing the algorithm. You could end up like, we have a Slack group for in-house SEOs, and we'll quite often see maybe 10 new articles a day of this is what people are sharing. That's just the curated ones. There's obviously a lot more than that around new tactics, new techniques, new tweaks to the algorithm that are happening all of the time. And my view on that is you need to pay attention because you don't want to go stale. If we did today what we did even 1 year ago, let alone 5, we're out of date. But if we do today what was news yesterday, we're just chasing our tail and we'll end up completely confused and we'll just go around in circles. So there's a balance between how do we use some of our own time to understand what's going on, but let's keep that bigger picture focus of here's the outcome we're trying to achieve. Yes, there might be some new things we'll throw into the mix to see how that works and help towards that objective. but we're not going to get distracted. It's a continual evolution and improvement that we have to do. But yeah, there's definitely a balance between what's the outcome, keep focused, let's hit it. And ultimately, from a client agency perspective, sitting in the agency shoes, I can be pretty confident that if we're going to hit a client's desired outcome, they're going to be pretty happy with whatever it is we've done. And we're definitely not the type of company that would do stuff that's kind of like underhand, short-termist. So for me, it's if we've achieved that, then the bells and whistles and everything else are nice as a cherry on top, but it's not where we start. So yeah, having that clear outcome, I think, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, it's a bit of a classic marketing problem, isn't it? This chasing the algorithm, or I suppose the PPC equivalent is completely restructuring your campaigns every 2 months because you've had a brilliant new idea and this is the strategy, and then 2 months later you restructure again and you start from scratch. And you see it so often, and it's just this classic problem where you get so caught up in adjusting to the latest small incremental change that you're losing, as you say, the big picture. And I guess that's what I really wanted to why I've been droning on about user intent so much, where we could be adjusting for every small incremental iterative little change in organic or paid algorithms, or we can understand what that underlying trend is, which is meeting user expectations, whether that's user experience or user intent. And as long as we've said, as long as you're making sure that your marketing is outcome based for business objectives and you're focusing on that user intent and experience, you're going to have a pretty solid marketing strategy.
Yeah, you definitely, I think that's it. You can't go far wrong by trying to please your customers, but you can definitely get distracted by trying to follow what Google's doing next. And I also think there's a certain element that I think actually, rather than looking at what Google's just done, look at where they're going. And I think that actually that way you can future-proof as opposed to react. And certainly I want to be in a position where if Google changes their algorithm, I'm not having sleepless nights of, oh no, what's going to happen? And actually I'm looking forward to it because I know we're doing the right things. Google are quite transparent, certainly a lot more than I'd say they used to be in terms of their own roadmap. What is it that they're trying to do? And I think that, to me, a lot of the big algorithm updates have actually been much more user-focused. So when you look at actually behavioral changes across the years, and when you look at this over years and certainly the last decade, the big thing for sure has been mobile. So mobile usage in terms of, I mean, we used to joke, and I think this is going back 10 years ago, it's a year of the mobile every year. And then it finally arrived. Yeah. and it felt like surely it has to be by now. But when you look at the algorithm updates, it's stuff like page speed, because on the mobile, it's obviously a bit slower to load that over, obviously now a 4 or maybe a 5G connection, but certainly back before that, it was a more painful experience that you had to have a fast loading page. And even now, you want to make sure that's a slick experience. And the bringing together of a mobile first index is a sensible and kind of the move that you would expect Google to take. And I think you can learn much more by understanding what is it they're trying to do. Some things won't pay off. So again, like one example of that might be voice search, where you can see Google want a slice of that pie if it's going to take off. And I think they have enough money to say, we don't know if this is going to take off massively, but if it does, we want to be a part of it. And if it doesn't, we've given it a shot. And I think from a marketing perspective, it's almost the same, where we're not going to say we're going to focus a large percentage of our budget on understanding this. But if you completely ignore every new trend, then you might miss out completely. So I think it's understanding how do things go, and mobile being the big one, app stores, obviously apps are hugely popular alongside search. But yeah, I think there's a lot to be looked at from a behavioral perspective. And I actually think one of the more interesting trends over the 12 months has actually been looking at things from a legal perspective. What do the Google anti-competitive regulations mean if that was to change? And if people are asking me about what's going to be the big thing for 2021, what's going to change in the algorithm, I would actually say look at the consequences of if the EU, for example, really clamps down on Google, and if maybe they say that, okay, you have too much data between analytics, search engine, Chrome, paying to be the default search engine on Apple devices, etc., that it's just all too interconnected, and some of those experiences start to get broken up. That's where I would say, okay, well, maybe the threat to the future could be stuff like, what if Apple launched their own search engine? What if Amazon really take this seriously and you get more vertical-led search, where Amazon is obviously clearly popular or very popular within shopping. That to me is much more exciting and interesting than the individual algorithm updates. So I think that's where I would be saying you should look. But again, back to the key point, look at your customers. and if those changes will impact how your customers engage with you, then it's clearly important. If it's more of a minor algorithm tweak, then if it's relative to your brands, then yes, pay attention. But more often than not, it may be a distraction as well. So you have to filter that news that you take in and the actions that you take off the back of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you make a really good point there, that there's always a risk with what trends are here to stay and which ones are temporary. But I agree with you that if you look at what the users want, and if you look at these changes over time, there are some trends that are very easy to identify that won't be going away, such as a shift to mobile because consumers are shifting to mobile, a focus on user experience and user intent because we have better information available about that now, and an increasing importance of linking actual business results to your marketing strategies, such as feeding back better data signals for performance evaluation, or even setting that strategy correctly from the start. I mean, those are things that are not going away because they are either user preferences or business needs.
Yeah, exactly.
I think one thing we talked about today, but also last time, is a little bit like how you build that strategy. And this is just, this again, it's a very, very simple approach to it, but it surprises me how often companies or people get this wrong, considering the fact that, it's, I know this is simplifying it, but it's effectively a 5-step process, which is that setting your goals and KPIs already there. Too often when people think about search, I see them thinking about, right, our goal is this CTR or that CPA, let alone the fact that CPA is a bit outdated. They're not even talking about what does that mean for the business? What problems are you trying to solve, and what are you trying to do? And I think if you're already getting it wrong at that stage, then you're not going to have a particularly strong SEO PPC strategy, because it's going to be a very introverted one. It's going to be one that looks at what looks good for this specific campaign does not necessarily translate to what looks good for the business.
Yeah, it's measuring what's easier to measure as opposed to what's most important.
Yeah. And again, too often I see you go wrong, but I think if a lot of brands just took a step, or companies took a step back and really asked themselves, is my SEO strategy, is my PPC strategy solving my actual business needs or business problems? And if they looked at it critically, I think a fair few of them will come to the conclusion that maybe it's not, that it's gotten so, I mean, that's a common criticism, particularly of PPC, right? It gets so caught up in its own language, its own lingo, its own metrics, that it's really hard to integrate it into a broader company strategy. It becomes its own section, its own department that doesn't play nice with others.
That's exactly right. And I think, again, SEO can get lost in some metrics that look good but don't mean anything. So the interior design company is a good example of their traffic dropped quite significantly. I think this is in 2019, because when we dug into it, they used to get a lot of traffic, which was best wallpapers 2018. And in 2019, people are now searching for 2019. When we looked into that, we found that the bounce rate was incredibly high, and no one actually came back and converted and become a customer. And in the end, rather than saying, okay, we could update this to 2019 and we could still get traffic, we just killed it, because it's like, well, actually, it's just a meaningless traffic inflation that is not doing anything for us. And actually, what we want to do is have a cluster of topics around the core business that are reinforcing us as an authority within that space. It's not about a land grab of how do we get traffic for anything that anyone is searching for, whether they have any association with the brand or not. And I feel like, again, taking the ego out of the situation and being more focused around the business goals, you shouldn't care how much traffic you get. You should care about how many customers you're converting and how much money you're making. And if that traffic is assisting towards those numbers, it's important. If it's doing nothing towards those numbers, why spend any time on it? Maybe just culling it is probably the best way to go.
Yeah.
I'm sure you would if it's PPC. If you were generating lots of traffic that didn't convert, you would probably not continue to spend money on it.
Absolutely. And I think that's kind of the crux of it, isn't it? That if you as an SEO team, a Ppc team, a search team can't prove if and what value you're driving and how that's relevant for business objectives, then how can you prove that you've got the right strategy?
Yeah, you can't.
And a surprisingly large amount of teams can't answer that question, or they try to solve that question after they've launched their structures and the strategy. So let's take a quick moment just to look at the key takeaways before we make sure we have time for questions. So, I mean, for us, at least in our conversations in the build-up to this webinar, I think the key things we really talked about a lot are that user intent is and will remain the foundation of how Google will be evaluating or optimizing SEO and PPC. And I'm seeing no evidence that that trend is going to buck or that it's going to weaken in any way. It's only going to become more important.
Agreed.
And because of that, what data you're using, how you're evaluating it, and if possible, how you're feeding it into it for PPC, a platform like Google Ads, is more important than ever. Because it means, do you have the right data to evaluate the success? And if you are meeting these strategic objectives that you set. And finally, user experience. I mean, users, they're smarter, they're wiser, they're more critical, and they are much less forgiving now about how you're adapting to their needs. And because, as we said before, because those barriers to entry are lower than ever in launching SEO and PPC, if you're not providing a good user journey, a good user experience with your SEO PPC strategy, then you're going to have a very big problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just linking back to the data, this is where there's a lot of alignment between SEO and PPC. I know if we've ever spoken to, this is probably more with potential clients, most of our clients, I would say, do use PPC. Some of them may want to start with SEO having not done PPC. And in those cases, my advice more often than not is run PPC, even if it's just as an experiment to learn from the data. Because if you've got, quite often people will have an idea in their head that we need to be number one for this market defining keyword. If that's the wrong keyword and you're just basing that on a keyword research, here's search demand, there's volume there. That's not enough data to say, I want to spend the next 12 months going for that keyword. You want to understand how that engages and converts with your website, because if you spent 12 months of time and budget to achieve, and let's say it works and you get to number one, you might then find that actually that traffic just isn't working for you. And that's a real shame at that point in time to have gone through all of that difficulty and getting there, and it's not the right thing to start with. Whereas in paid search, you have that data and you can take it so much further than just search volume when you can understand conversion rates, time on site, the whole engagement around that, that you're just not going to get instantly from SEO, because it is a longer term process in order to secure those rankings. So I do think here it's very much it's almost data first from a PPC perspective, then informs the user intent from an SEO perspective. And then from there, we can understand much more about how they convert. And it could be similar to what you're saying before, one page, maybe different keywords, different topics, convert in different ways. So which are the ones that we should really be prioritizing and going for? And you want to have a data-driven answer to that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just to make sure we have some time for questions as well. I've, of course, prepared a few for you also, because I'm always curious about asking you questions. Let's see if we've had any questions submitted. Okay, first one is, what tips do you have for optimizing paid and organic activities when your business is a niche aspect of a broader industry? Interesting. I've got a few thoughts on that. What are your thoughts from an organic perspective on that, Kevin?
I'm trying to get my head around it a little bit. So when your business is a niche aspect of a broader industry, I think it maybe links to what I just said, which is actually understand the data, understand what's that keyword set that you should be going for. And once you can get a full picture of this is how well people are engaging with your sites, and obviously there might be tweaks that you need to make to both keywords and landing page in order to match that up, then I think it's a case of how do you bring that together on the SEO perspective. And I think something else that we haven't touched upon quite so much is actually the role between paid and organic. So with that, you might want to say, if you look at the user journey across awareness, consideration, conversion, actually, how do you prioritize your paid search budget on the stuff that you know is more likely to make you money? But then maybe how do you use SEO for the less competitive but highly popular or highly topical awareness topics that can capture people in earlier in that buying cycle? So it's more of a touch point. So I think my advice would be thinking about the user, start with the commercial terms because that's what's going to make you money. Build out your paid search offering, try to mirror that with SEO, and then maybe build out around the user journey afterwards with more of the awareness topics.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense because I mean, you've got to start somewhere, right? And then start filtering down from there. I think otherwise you might paralyze yourself with trying to figure out like what's the right approach.
Yeah.
And the only thing I have to add on to that from a PPC perspective is that the example I have in mind right now is B2B. We work with quite a lot of B2B companies, which by definition often are quite niche because they tend to be quite specialized. And that means you're competing for quite general searches that might be relevant for you, but you're not sure. I mean, that's a classic niche product or niche industry problem. Mm-hmm. And what we were talking about a little bit earlier, that, you know, like Google's gotten a lot better at understanding which signals are important for you. That's not just something we're saying. Like, we have seen time and again that Google's decision-making, or other search platforms, for instance, in determining which user is the right one for you, is now significantly better than it was years ago, to the degree where even if we try to overrule that logic, I highly doubt our decision-making would be better, because Google has access to these user intent or behavioral signals that we do not have access to. So the question is, how can you then influence that decision-making or the choice of that user? And the best way you can do that is in the data that you feed back to the platform. So imagine if you're using Google Ads for this, you need to determine what a good result looks like for you, what a good conversion looks like for you, whether that is a subscription, a purchase, a downloading of a white paper. I don't really know. Maybe that's through a CRM tool that you're going to be plugging back into Google Ads. Maybe that's through running Amazon Web Apps or Google Cloud, where you're running calculations based on the actual value of these conversions, and then you're pushing that back into the platform. Because what you're doing then is that you're telling the platform, and therefore the platform's algorithm, which behavioral signals led to the result that you actually wanted out of those. And those will in turn be fed back into the users that are going to be showing or prioritized for your keywords. And that's an area that a lot of people are still overlooking. They are just assuming that a base measurement of a result or an action or a conversion is enough to get those results. Mm-hmm. But because of that, there's an opportunity there for competitive advantage, that if you get really good at the evaluation of those outcomes and you push that data back into the platform, you'll be having significantly better results. It's a bit of a backwards approach, really, that you're going to be acquiring better traffic by doing a better job at evaluating the outcome. Yeah,
and I guess the more data you have to make decisions off of, the smarter those decisions are going to be. So it's, it's about understanding what the aggregate data is showing you and then making a decision off the back of it.
Yeah. And I think a common complaint, I hear that, is that people think, well, my product's too niche. We don't get enough volume. We don't get enough data. There are absolutely ways to work around that. You can look at fractional conversions. You can look at micro conversions. You can look at kind of like proxy actions that make sense for you. There's a lot you can be doing there. But that is probably the approach where we've seen the most success for that. And again, I'm basing my answer on B2B, because that is by definition usually quite niche. But I think this carries over to direct to consumer that's niche as well in a broader industry.
Exactly. We do have another question actually, which is, thanks for a great presentation. How to avoid keyword cannibalization between PPC and SEO? And I think likewise, I've got some thoughts on that, but I don't know, do you want to kick off?
It's such a classic question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I mean, the traditional approach to that is that you try a PPC strategy where you for a time being turn off your branded search keywords and measure the impact that has on your organic. But that's, I'm not going to call that outdated, because there's absolutely still value in doing that. But I think there are better approaches now. And I think first and foremost, it's understanding cannibalization is really hard if you're really looking at longer customer journeys. And I have some hesitations about the word cannibalization because it's still kind of siloed thinking, right? It's thinking that a user might only have one interaction, and that's going to be either organic or paid, and then they convert, and kind of neglecting everything that builds up to that. Bit of a cop-out answer, but I just want to so I have a little bit of skepticism there that people are very anti keyword or performance overlap between SEO and PPC when it doesn't necessarily need to be something that's bad. But I kind of want to hear what your thoughts are as well, Kevin.
I think you stole my answer. No, so my answer would be a question of why would you want to avoid keyword cannibalization, for the reason that if you've got a double listing of paid and organic together, that can be quite powerful of influencing clicks. I think there's definitely an argument if you're spending a lot of money on your branded terms and you already rank organically, then do you need to do that? And I think quite often the answer might be it depends if competitors are bidding. If your competitor is number one for your brand organically, then absolutely you want to beat them. But yeah, certainly if it's a commercial term, I would have no problem I would look at it from an organic perspective. We want to maximize rankings for the stuff that makes you money. And the stuff that makes you money is the stuff that you want to be spending money on in PPC as well. And then it's more a case of an ROI and a profit conversation of and again, it's never a case of, for me, SEO or PPC, certainly at a wider strategy level. It's a case of how do you make the best of both of them. And that might lead into maybe further down the line, you're looking at your marketing as a blended rate. But I think at a keyword level, you might not be understanding or needing to understand we rank organically for this keyword, we rank paid for this. That maybe beyond the exception I gave earlier, which is awareness for organic, commercial for paid, but also you'd go commercial for organic first and foremost anyway. If people are searching for your products or kind of consideration level keywords, then you absolutely want to be ranking organically. And if it's converting for you, you absolutely would want to continue spending from a PPC perspective as well.
Yep, I agree. Great minds think alike, Kevin. We've got one more question, and we just got one in as well. Can you please list your top 3 reporting tools to gain the necessary insights for bridging paid and organic search?
Should we split these between us maybe? But
yeah.
I think one for us and a trend that we're seeing is actually it's Google Data Studio has become very powerful for us. So we're now probably using certainly this with link tools. The challenge you have certainly with an SEO is you have an SEO tool for everything, because SEO has got deeper in terms of the expertise you need. So if you want a page speed tool, you have a page speed tool. Google have their own. If you want to understand about indexing, crawling, links, etc., the rankings, there's so much that you can pull into. And for us now, it's the challenge with that is that information then gets siloed. So for us, actually using the APIs of these third-party tools is often more valuable than the user interface itself. So actually, if we can pull that into Search Console and say, firstly, here's your analytics and your Search Console data, but secondly, how do we then use the tool of your choice for crawling, the tool of your choice for links, etc. And there's a number of them that you can use. It helps to show the picture between each other. So if you've got how much traffic are you getting for those pages and trying to show different levels of reports. So something I should give credit to Nick Wilson from Vodafone for this, because his model we've definitely learned a lot from in terms of Google Data Studio reporting for different audiences. So having persona profiles for a board level report, you just want to see how much money you're making organically, what are your top performing markets. You probably don't even need to know anything more than that. At a marketing level, you might want to know a bit more competitively. So actually against competitors, how's our market share and what does that look like? So again, there's different benchmarking tools that we can bring in to show search visibility. And at a tactical, actionable level, it could be how many page errors do we have that we need to fix? How much content are we publishing versus our competitors? So you have the lead and lag indicators behind showing what's really going to move the needle on an actionable basis. And I think having those different views for different people for us has been very important. So I feel like my answer is one tool, but at the same time, it's about 17 because it's like, how do you bring them all together?
Yeah. No, I think it's a good answer. And I do broadly agree with you. I think a lot of teams, a lot of companies are very keen to always buy new tools or new platforms. There's definitely a kind of marketing or data tech fatigue setting in where we speak to a lot of brands or companies that we work with where they've got every single ad tech or data tech product you can think of. They're spending, I don't want to know how much money on it. Whereas ultimately they could be solving those reporting or insights needs with 2 or 3 of them, plus a lot of like open or free tools like Google Data Studio. Mm-hmm. Even to the degree where we quite often build simple custom solutions using Google Cloud, for instance, that directly integrates to some of these platforms. And that always makes people a little skeptical when they think about, oh, well, I don't really want to build my own because then I got to wait 12 to 18 months. I don't even know if it's going to be any good. It doesn't have to be complicated. Very often, some of these insights needs are pretty simple and can be solved with Search Console, some publicly available SEO reporting, or I mean, if you want to use SEMrush or Ahrefs, fine. Yeah. Insights from Google Ads, because I mean, competitive insights there, you're not really going to get anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Google Data Studio, and your first-party data. Too many people don't make good use of their own first-party data before they start looking at other sources.
Yeah, very true. And I think, again, it probably comes back to what's the desired outcome, and then what's the best way to measure that desired outcome, as opposed to starting with the what's easiest to measure, and then let's report on that. It can be easy to get lost amongst the metrics, and really I quite often talk about hierarchy KPIs, and at the top of that, if you look at it as a pyramid, you've always got revenue. Like or business value, whether that's leads, but that's the key metric that you're aiming towards, and then everything else tells the story in terms of how you're going to get there.
Yeah, I think you're completely right there, and I know we've kind of given cop-out answers to this question so far, but it is true though. I mean, people are very, very keen to buy a new platform that's probably not going to solve all their problems, but they think it will, which is a very dangerous mindset to have. But yeah, revenue or business results, which is almost always revenue, is top of the hierarchy. It drives everything else. And if you're not in a position where you can properly evaluate revenue impact or what those businesses mean for you, then the insights tools aren't going to matter because you can't link it.
I remember someone ages ago who was asked the question, should we spend $100,000 a year plus on, I think it's Omniture, but I can't remember, to be fair, but it is one of the more expensive enterprise level packages. And the answer, which I'm pretty sure actually came from Adobe itself, so they're not actually trying to almost sell their own product, but it was hire an analyst before you hire the platform and solution, because if you've got all of the best data in the world but no one that's going to tell you what to do with it, then you're better off having semi-accurate data that you can make decisions off of and do something with, as opposed to 100% accurate data that you're not taking action on. And I think that's the key. At different stages of the journey, you need more powerful tools, but I've always said in SEO, the number one ranking factor is doing. It's if you take action, there'll be a reaction and something will happen. If you do nothing, then your competitors will probably catch you and overtake you. So I think that's the key thing. Is how do you line things up at relevant to that stage of where you're at in a way that you can take action upon it.
Yeah. So I guess to summarize, I mean, I'm a simple creature. Don't spend loads of money on plenty of third-party platforms that are probably not going to solve your problems. Have a good data visualization tool. Google Data Studio, it's pretty much free. Well, it is free. Make sure you have good data connectors to pull in data. There are ready-made ones for a lot of platforms that are free to use, but we also use tools like Supermetrics, fantastic. So like invest in a good data connecting tool and understand your first-party data. Make sure that you can understand your first-party data. With, of course, implied being you have a good analyst, as you say, Kevin. So like if you've got those three, then you're going to come a long way, because there is no magic tool that's going to answer all your questions. It doesn't exist.
Yep, completely agree.
Cool. That's 4 o'clock for us on the dot. So I'm afraid we're out of time. But yeah, managed to answer all the questions. Thank you very, very much for this, Kevin. It's been really good talking to you again.
Yeah, likewise. Really enjoyed that.
Cool. So we'll be sending follow-up emails with the recording of the webinar and some content as well. And we look forward to seeing you on the next one.